Yes, Professor, I'm asking the raft of measures which have been taken by the government by way of tax cuts in terms of cushioning the economy. What do you make of them? Are we in step in the right direction, or is it just too little?
So there's a wonderful Kikuyu proverb that says that every case must begin from the stomach. And I think initially governments made some really good moves. They did begin by looking at issues around financing the vulnerable, but very quickly it seems to have changed into, to put it politely, a very opportunistic funding of lobby groups, and it looks to me more like they're moving in the direction of the loudest voices within government and those that are connected to them. So I'll give you an example. When you're trying to redirect the fiscal system of a country during an emergency, the first question is not tax, it's not increase of tax at any point in time, but it is redirection of funding. And some of the questions that still remain unclear, I think, to everybody in the country is, how much was the emergency money they had? How much have they spent? How much is left? How much has been sent down to the counties? Now, have they taken budgets that now they cannot use, for example, their travel budgets and their transport allowances? And have we now shifted those into emergency reactions? These are the first things you're supposed to do when you're rejigging your economy. The second thing is to then start looking at emergency procurement processes. And again, I haven't seen reaction in government on how to do emergency reactions, how to get manufacturing to be retooled, for example, quickly. So the equipment coming in for frontline healthcare workers is coming in, but so late in the day when people have already been infected and or exposed. The other issues that have to come in are issues around price controls. There was an immediate increase in prices of certain goods, especially those that are under the dogo economy, right at the bottom. And fortunately, because there's not been any price controls there, prices of small items have gone up higher. So we need to look at those 18 million people that are running households in this country. And we need to make sure that those 18 million are actually able to subsist. And of course, the one directive, the one to stay at home, has clearly not worked. And the question then becomes, why has it not worked? It's because people don't have money in their pockets. And that probably should have been one of the first and most important interventions government should have gone into, is ensuring some kind of basic minimum income, freezing any firing of especially people earning below 50,000 shillings a month, and then redirecting funding across government. Thank you.
I see. And Professor, just to be fair to the government, in terms of when you talk about retooling the manufacturing sector, we are aware a number of players are beginning to, for example, produce masks, which is actually not in their ordinary line of business. Don't you think manufacturing is being retooled, albeit at a gradual phase?
So yes, so you have to give government credit, right? This is a completely new situation for everybody. So everybody is at a loss on how to deal with things. But as we go along, people are figuring out slowly how to do things faster. But I will tell you that the immediate responses to a fiscal system is to see how to move money. It's to see how to keep money in the economy. And I think those are one of my biggest concerns. I don't see an effort to keep money inside the economy so far, and then to ensure you're targeting the vulnerable. But in this case, for purposes of manufacturing specifically, there are only certain industries that will start to suffer, but these industries can be redirected. And what we need people throwing out ideas also to manufacturing, to give them ideas on how to retool their particular scenarios. So I'll give you an example. We have a project at the University of Nairobi right now on the manufacture of ventilators. And they've already identified an engineering company locally that is going to be able to now do this, because of course they cannot work on their current issues. So this is a wonderful moment in one way to actually bring together the people who are the thinkers and the ones with the ideas with the other stakeholders in the normal economy, the business people, the private sector, but also government. And unfortunately, this connection has not yet been properly cemented.
I see. And Professor, let me ask you a question. When you talk about putting money in the pocket, some have argued that instead of tax cuts, perhaps we should have seen cash transfers from the government. What do you make of this?
Sorry, you'll have to repeat that. I didn't hear you.
Some are saying that instead of having tax cuts, perhaps we should have had cash transfers from the government to the most vulnerable Kenyans. What do you make of this?
So I'll come back to those 18 million people that are either running households and are all over the age of 18, or they are living within families. And one of the most important things at this point this time is actually a universal basic income. There's already been a pilot project in the country for the past 12 years to have a minimum basic income, and about 12,000 to 20,000 families were targeted, and it seems to be successful. It's a really small amount. They get about 3,000 shillings a month. And even though it is not a lot, it is something. I do know that government doesn't have enough money, no matter which way you look at it, to finance it. And there's been a lot of debates across the country, both on social media and otherwise, talking about how the figures are just impossible for government. But government has this whole of government approach, which is a really excellent approach. And it's time to push it forward to a whole of country approach. We can access private foundations in this country. We can adopt a family for the purposes of the next 6 months, for example, or cash transfers of between maybe 5,000 or 10,000, whatever you can afford. And we also have the possibility of funds that has come into government. Again, I go back to my initial statement that we know that money is coming into government, but we don't know what the total amount is, and we don't know how they're utilizing it. And so I think the other problem that is starting to emerge here is that government is really not communicating effectively on how it is funding its endeavors and what it is doing and not doing. And now is the time to bring in private sector foundations to start putting money into this, because I'm sorry to say this, but private foundations in the country have been completely silent. And it surprises me, but it also really worries me. Thank you.
I see. And Professor, before we take a break on this conversation, we've had the Tax Laws Amendment Bill right now, which some have been aggrieved by it. And actually, the LSK is moving to court to challenge it. What do you think about the Tax Laws Amendment Bill?
I think it's very unfortunate. Parliament is not sitting. This step should have been, from a legislative perspective, to make sure we had an Emergency Response Act ready. And under the Emergency Response Act, we would have been able to then delineate exactly what government could or could not do during that emergency period very carefully. We haven't done that. And what surprises me is Parliament hasn't set up remote sessions. Why are they not on all the other forms of media and social platforms, speaking to each other in Parliament the way we are doing it, for example, at the university, because we are teaching online? Why can we not have a parliamentary session going on online? But when I look at the content of the bill, it looks like they started out well, and they started to put in provisions that were specifically targeted for the pandemic. And then suddenly it almost lost control. And we have helicopters. I mean, there's 2 or 3 pages of just tax exemptions for different types of helicopters. But, we've downed all flights. I don't understand why that is even in the bill. So I understand why the Law Society is going forward. Of course, I'm a member of the Law Society, but it's giving me a lot of concern. I mean, I looked at the exemptions list, and fresh eggs are being exempt. So importation of fresh eggs are being exempted, and caviar. And maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but it really is not making a lot of logical sense. The other thing I noticed they've missed out on is making sure that there are waivers for actual equipment and chemicals that are going to need to come into the country in order for us to actually, for example, do research on those areas, but also to develop innovative processes. So if we're going to bring in parts of a ventilator or chemicals to help us design the medicine for the vaccines, I'm not so sure that they've actually covered that carefully. Universities are not being given waivers for the research work they're doing, and we have about 30 projects up and running in the areas of the pandemic. So that's from the university's perspective. But from the wider country's perspective, I was surprised to see that investment company registered in Luxembourg is being given a tax break. So this doesn't make sense. So there's details in it that don't actually belong in an act that's an emergency act. And then on the other hand, there is these set of thought out interventions, some of which are good, but are going to get lost if we're not careful, because they're being mixed up with what would be normal tax exemptions and incentives or tax amendments we would put in a normal year without an emergency.
Professor, if you can still hear me, I am curious to know, you're in an institution which is highly reputed in the subject of academia. What is the University of Nairobi doing around this issue of curbing the spread of COVID-19?
Well, thank you for that question, actually. Since about February, we've been pulling together all the medical researchers working on the pandemic. And out of 6 researchers that we have at the university, 3 of them are actually part of the national task force already. So one of the first things we did was to make sure they were out there and that people knew about them. The second thing we then did, which was towards the end of March, is we began to encourage our members of staff to reach out to us and let us know what they're working on. And so far, we have about 30 different groups of researchers working on different areas, from vaccine trials and community outreach to food security. I mentioned earlier ventilator fabrication, but we also have teams working on rapid response issues to economic and financial implications. We also have people working on the issue of cash transfers, but also mortality surveillance. So we have a huge cohort of researchers. I think there are almost about 100 of them working on different areas of research connected to the pandemic. In addition to that, we immediately set up a pipeline to the National Task Force as well as other national agencies, and on a rolling basis have been submitting interventions at a very granular level for consideration by government. So everything from techniques of quarantine and surveillance to food security interventions, as well as issues around minimum wage. All of these have been forwarded over the past 2 to 3 weeks. We're continuing to receive them from our staff and researchers across the university. And so we continue to give them. We've already submitted 2 sets, and there's a third set being compiled as we go along. In addition, for purposes of public outreach, we actually have set up a blog series on the website of the DVC for research. And we've launched a webinar series. So last Thursday, we had our first webinar on the fiscal and economic implications of the pandemic. And tomorrow, we're going to have a webinar, of course, open to the public. It's going to look at issues of food security, and the following week, the issue of emergencies and humanitarian efforts that will need to take place during the pandemic. So we are continuing to receive different types of research pieces. We're continuing to support them, and we're continuing to send them up into government. Thank you.
I see. And let me just ask this question, Professor. We are in the situation where there's a question around what this actually means for our budgetary making process, because never before have we seen a tax law amendment bill of this scale at this time of the year. Now, this has implications because not too far from now in June, we should be having the budget, national budget being tabled. How do you think this impacts the whole budgetary cycle?
Oh, it's going to throw the budget cycle into a bit of a mess. And I think the reason that it's going to cause even bigger problems is because they put in interventions that are not pandemic related or emergency related. I foresee that there will not be the submission of another tax bill as a result. Maybe this year, maybe not even next year, unless it is to now mop up the mistakes that we are making in this particular bill, if it does go through. As far as our 12-month cycle, the element of public participation now is completely lost. And although I didn't mention it earlier, I think it is important to make sure that we do public participation through online platforms. It does exclude people. Not everybody is on the internet, but it is better than nothing. And unfortunately, the government's action so far is not to include too much public participation. They still consider, just look at the normal stakeholders. And this is not a normal situation. So it has to be, the abnormal must be in that mix as well, or the unusual as is. And the budget cycle is going to have problems for the next, I think, 2 to 3 years. And we'll be lucky if we can mobilize it as a result of this action of government. Thank you.
I see. And Professor, still on the tax laws amendment bill, some have raised a concern that it is actually going to trigger a rise in the cost of some basic commodities because of the whole issue of some products were initially zero rated. Now they've been removed from that list. You're talking about bread, medicaments. How do you feel this augurs, especially in light of the situation where we should be cushioning people from high cost?
Yes. So like I said in the beginning, if you want to rework your fiscal system in an emergency, you have to focus on a completely different set of things first. And tax usually is supposed to take a back seat until you're very clear on the other fiscal dimensions you have to put in place. So yes, if this bill does go through in the direction things are going, prices are already high. What maybe people are not reflecting enough on is the fact that we are all globally, as the pandemic continues, we're all globally putting pressure on the same goods. So that means that everything is made by everybody at the same time. So things are not coming as easily. the focus should be less on exemptions or putting taxes on things, it should be more on encouraging the local production of those key areas. And again, now that is not a tax response, but it is a fiscal response. So will it result in price increases? Yes, it already has resulted in price increases. The fact that people are not mobile, and of course, we don't have a good relationship with our police force. So are the police able to check if prices are being maintained or not? And if they were to even try, would people even appreciate the fact that they are trying to do something to look after them, as opposed to the normal situation when we feel very threatened by them, unfortunately. So even the systems that are in place are actually crippling the ability of the government to work things out a lot better than they could have in another situation, which is why I will take you back to my original answer. We need a bill on emergencies. And the law school, for example, at the University of Nairobi has forwarded a bill to the Attorney General's chambers. You need an emergency bill first before you start going into these kind of tax issues. Thank you. Can I just end with a Kalenjin proverb, which I absolutely love? And they say that we share the same sun, but we don't share the same roof. And I think it's really important that government understands the roofs and doesn't just look up at the sun.
I see. Thank you, Professor. But before I let you go, I'm just keen to know, what's your outlook on the economy this year? Of course, we've had the National Treasury slashing its growth focus. So is the Central Bank of Kenya. What do you think in terms of the outlook for 2020?
Well, I think it's going to be mixed. I think if we're lucky, we're going to have retooling of certain manufacturing. It means that some manufacturing businesses will stay in place. But I do think that tourism is going to take a big hit. And I think it is important for the tourism industry to look at different ways of trying to do the process. I have ideas, but that is a different conversation. I think that we're also going to have a problem if we have to continue to import goods and services. And I think we need to start thinking about supporting actually the universities and the TVET programs across the country to make sure that we are producing an as self-sufficient as we possibly can be in the coming year or two. There have already been visa waivers, for example, for medical doctors and healthcare staff to go to other countries. These are going to impact our ability to cope and survive. So both at the services level and at the goods level, there is going to be a lot of instability. And unless we have a team looking at it from an overall basis, is a multidisciplinary stakeholder team, including the thinkers and the private sector, as well as public sector and government, to see how to target responses industry by industry. We're in for, I think, an economic downslide, unfortunately.
And the Central Organization of Trade Union COTU is now calling upon the government to embark on distribution of food items in the informal settlement to try and cushion households from the effects of COVID-19. Secretary General Francis Atwoli says it is imperative that those in informal settlements are given a cushion at this time. This happens even as analysts warn that the housing sector is extremely vulnerable to the slowdown being brought about by the spread of COVID-19 virus. Washombogwa from Saiton Investments says that the housing sector is particularly exposed given the level Washom Bogwa, a research analyst at Citon Investments, Washom Bogwa, a research analyst at Citon Washom Bogwa, a research analyst at Citon Investments, gives a reason why the housing sector is particularly vulnerable.